Have you ever wondered what truly lies beneath the surface of this world? I'm not talking about the ground under your feet or the ocean you've seen on a map. I mean the places that no human was ever meant to reach, the places we were never meant to disturb. I used to think such questions were the realm of conspiracy theorists and late-night television. Then I got the call. And now I can't stop asking myself, what if some things are buried for a reason? What if the secrets beneath the ice aren't just relics of the past, but the beginning of something we were never meant to understand? My name is Dr. Alan Grayson. I've worked for NASA for over a decade, most of it spent chasing storms and analysing atmospheric anomalies. It's not glamorous work, but I've always preferred it that way. No headlines, no grand discoveries, just data, cold and clear. Numbers don't lie, people do. That's why the email stood out. It came late one evening while I was still at my desk, sipping a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The subject line was blunt: classified assignment, immediate response required. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I wasn't exactly at the forefront of any groundbreaking projects. I was just one scientist in a sea of specialists. The message inside was even stranger. Dr. Grayson, your expertise in atmospheric phenomena is required for a high-priority project. Prepare for immediate transfer to Facility Polaris, Alaska. Further details will follow. Facility Polaris. The name meant nothing to me. I ran a quick search, but nothing came up. No records, no mentions in NASA's archives, not even a rumor. That was the first red flag. The second was the name at the bottom of the email: Dr. Samuel Renner. Renner was a legend in scientific circles, though not always for the right reasons. His work on gravitational anomalies had earned him both acclaim and controversy. He was the kind of man who didn't just push boundaries, he obliterated them. If Renner was involved, this wasn't going to be a routine assignment. I ignored the unease creeping into my chest and fired off a response. By the time I hit send, my phone was already ringing. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in the back of a rattling transport vehicle, staring out at the endless expanse of white. The Alaskan wilderness was a desolation unlike anything I'd ever seen. There were no landmarks, no trees, just snow and ice stretching out in every direction, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of distant mountains. The others in the vehicle were silent. Beside me, a technician named Kyle O'Donnell clutched his bag like a lifeline, his nervous energy palpable. Across from us sat Victor Harlow, a grizzled security officer with the kind of face that seemed carved out of stone. He hadn't said more than 2 words since we boarded. "This place," O'Donnell muttered, finally breaking the silence. "It doesn't even feel real, like we're driving into the middle of nowhere." "Because we are," Harlow said without looking up. His voice was low, gruff. "Nowhere's the best place to hide things no one's supposed to find." I glanced at him, but he didn't elaborate. I wasn't sure I wanted him to. When we finally reached Facility Polaris, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the glacier. The building itself was almost invisible, buried into the side of an icy cliff. Smoke curled lazily from a few vents, and the only indication of its presence was a massive steel gate flanked by motion sensors and automated turrets. As the vehicle stopped, the gate groaned open, revealing a dark tunnel that disappeared into the glacier. The air inside was colder than I expected, biting through my coat as I stepped out. "Dr. Grayson," a voice called out from the shadows. A tall man in a black parka emerged, his face half hidden by the hood. He exuded authority, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. "I'm Dr. Renner, welcome to Polaris." "Dr. Renner," I said, shaking his gloved hand. It was colder than the air. "What exactly am I here to assist with?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're standing on the edge of something extraordinary," he said, "and potentially catastrophic." The steel doors ahead of us hissed open, and I caught the faint scent of metal and something else, something acrid, almost chemical. As I followed Renner inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't walking into a lab. I was walking into a trap. The air inside Facility Polaris was colder than the Alaskan wilderness outside, carrying with it a sterile metallic scent that clung to my throat. The walls of the corridor were smooth and seamless, lined with faintly glowing strips of light embedded in the floor. It wasn't like any NASA lab I'd ever worked in. It wasn't even like any lab I'd heard of. Dr. Samuel Renner led the way, his steps brisk and purposeful. I followed in silence, my boots echoing on the polished floor. Behind me, Victor Harlow and Kyle O'Donnell trailed, their faces tense. O'Donnell clutched his bag like a talisman, while Harlow's sharp eyes scanned every corner, his hand never far from the holstered weapon on his hip. "You'll find things here are different," Renner said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I didn't miss. "We're operating on the edge of what science can currently explain, and some things that it can't." "That's a vague way of saying I have no idea what I'm walking into," I said, keeping my tone even. "Atmospheric research, right? That's why I'm here." Renner glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Partly. You'll see soon enough." We emerged into a massive atrium that made me stop in my tracks. The space was cavernous, carved directly into the glacier, with walls of translucent ice reinforced by steel beams. Dim lights embedded in the ice cast eerie shadows that seemed to shift and ripple like living things. In the center of the room stood a structure I couldn't quite comprehend. It was a massive cylinder, its surface a patchwork of smooth metal plates and jagged edges that seemed to pulse faintly with light. A tangle of cables and tubes extended from its base, snaking across the floor to connect to banks of computers and machinery lining the walls. The hum it emitted was low and constant, a sound that seemed to resonate in my chest. "What the hell is that?" O'Donnell muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Renner turned to me, ignoring O'Donnell entirely. "That," he said, gesturing to the structure, "is why you're here." I stepped closer, my curiosity outweighing my unease. The cylinder was taller than a house, and its surface was covered in faint glowing symbols, patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "A fragment," Renner said, "recovered from beneath the ice." I frowned. "A fragment of what?" "That's the question," he replied, his voice heavy with something I couldn't place. "We found it 6 months ago, buried nearly 2 miles beneath the surface. It was emitting a signal, something we couldn't decipher. But when we brought it here, it activated." "Activated?" My unease deepened. "Activated how?" Renner's lips pressed into a thin line. It started emitting waves, energy bursts. At first they were harmless, background radiation, nothing unusual. But then, he hesitated, glancing at Harlow, who stood silently, his jaw tight. Then things began to change. Before I could press him, a door on the far side of the room hissed open, and another figure entered. Dr. Eugene Maddox was instantly recognizable from the personnel files I'd reviewed before the trip. A tall, wiry man with an almost manic energy about him. His lab coat was stained and his hair was disheveled, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "Ah, you must be Grayson," he said, striding toward me. He extended a hand, which I shook reluctantly. "Good to have another scientist on board. Renner's explanations can be lacking." "Dr. Maddox," I said. "I take it you're the one studying this fragment." "Studying, experimenting, theorizing. Take your pick," Maddox said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "This thing is a treasure trove of unknowns. The energy readings alone are rewriting what we know about physics. But that's not even the best part." I raised an eyebrow. "What is the best part?" Maddox gestured for me to follow him to one of the monitors. The screen displayed a live feed of the fragment, overlaid with a dizzying array of data points. But what caught my attention was the faint, rhythmic pulse emanating from the structure. "It's alive," Maddox said, his voice almost reverent. "Not in a biological sense, but in its activity. It reacts to stimuli, light, sound, even proximity, and the symbols. He trailed off, his grin widening. We think they're a language. I stared at the screen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. A language? You think this thing is trying to communicate? Exactly, Maddox said. We've been trying to decode it, but the patterns are complex. Too complex. It's almost like it's not meant for us to understand. Maybe it's not, Harlow muttered from behind me, his voice heavy with suspicion. Maybe it's not meant for us at all, Maddox waved him off. Skepticism is healthy, but this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Whatever this is, it's not terrestrial. It's proof that we're not alone. That doesn't mean it's friendly, Harlow countered. I didn't respond. My eyes were locked on the fragment, its symbols shifting like liquid fire. For the first time, I wondered if coming here had been a mistake. It was 3:12 a.m. when the first alarm went off. The sharp, high-pitched wail sliced through the otherwise silent facility like a blade, jolting me out of a restless sleep. For a moment, I sat upright in my narrow bunk, disoriented and unsure if the sound was real or just a nightmare. Then, the voice of Kyle O'Donnell crackled over the intercom, frantic and shaky. Can someone get to Sector 3? We've got, something happening down here, now." I threw on my coat and boots, the cold of the facility already seeping into my skin as I stepped into the dimly lit hallway. My breath fogged in the air, and the faint hum of the fragment, the constant, unrelenting thrum, felt louder than usual, more insistent. By the time I reached Sector 3, the rest of the team had already gathered. O'Donnell was by the control panel, his hands trembling as he tried to silence the blaring alarm. Victor Harlow stood nearby, one hand on his holstered sidearm, his eyes scanning the room for threats. Dr. Eugene Maddox was at the far end, practically pressed against the observation window that overlooked the fragment. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "You tell me," O'Donnell snapped, not looking up from the console. "The energy readings just spiked out of nowhere. I mean, look at this." He jabbed at the monitor, which displayed a chaotic series of graphs, the lines spiking wildly into the red. "It's like the fragments reacting to something." "Reacting to what?" Harlow growled, his stance tense. "We haven't touched the damn thing." "Maybe we haven't," Maddox said, his voice laced with that same manic excitement he always seemed to carry. "But that doesn't mean it isn't aware of us." I moved toward the observation window, my stomach tightening as I looked down at the fragment. It sat in the middle of the containment chamber, its surface pulsing with a faint, irregular light. The symbols carved into its metallic shell were moving, actually moving, shifting and rearranging themselves in ways that defied logic. "That's new," I muttered. Maddox nodded, his grin wide. "Isn't it incredible? It's evolving. It's trying to say something. Or it's trying to do something," Harlow said darkly, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun. "Enough," Dr. Renner's voice cut through the tension as he entered the room, his expression unreadable. "What's the status?" O'Donnell finally managed to silence the alarm, though the chaotic data on the screen remained. "The energy levels are through the roof," he said, his voice still shaky. "And the fragment, it's, doing whatever that is." He gestured toward the shifting symbols. Renner's gaze locked onto the fragment, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or something worse. "Seal the chamber," he ordered. "Double the containment field. I don't want any further changes until we know what's causing this." "Wait," Maddox protested, turning to face him. "We can't just lock it down. This is a breakthrough, proof that the fragment is interactive. If we study it..." "We'll study it under controlled conditions," Renner interrupted, his tone icy. "Not when it's behaving unpredictably." As the technicians moved to reinforce the containment field, the lights in the room flickered. For a moment, the faint hum of the fragment grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the floor. The symbols on its surface flared brighter, their shifting patterns accelerating. "What the hell is it doing now?" Harlow muttered, his voice low. The air in the room grew heavier, thicker, as if the fragment's presence was pressing down on us. My chest tightened and I realized I was holding my breath. And then, Just as suddenly as it began, the light dimmed and the hum returned to its usual steady rhythm. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Maddox exhaled slowly, a look of almost reverent awe on his face. "Did you feel that?" he whispered. "It's alive." "No," Harlow said flatly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "It's dangerous, and if you don't see that, you're out of your damn mind." Renner turned to him, his expression hard. "That's enough, Harlow. Everyone back to your stations. I'll review the data and determine our next steps." As the group began to disperse, I lingered by the observation window, my eyes fixed on the fragment. The symbols had stopped moving, but something about it felt different. The air around it seemed to shimmer faintly, and I could have sworn I saw the faintest outline of something else. Something behind the fragment lurking just out of sight. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening here, we were already in over our heads. By the next day, the atmosphere in Facility Polaris had changed. The usual hum of the fragment, which had always been a steady presence, now felt different, more invasive, as though it were vibrating beneath my skin. The other scientists seemed restless, their movements jittery, their eyes darting nervously whenever they thought no one was looking. It wasn't just the fragment anymore. Something else was wrong, something deeper. I found myself lingering in the cafeteria that morning, a stale cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The room was almost empty save for Kyle O'Donnell, who sat hunched over his tablet at the far end of the table. His usual nervous energy was amplified now, his hands trembling as he swiped through pages of data with feverish intensity. "What's got you so rattled?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. O'Donnell jumped, nearly dropping the tablet. He glanced at me, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. Just trying to figure out what the hell's going on with that thing." "The fragment?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "You're not the only one." He shook his head, lowering his voice to a whisper. "It's not just the fragment, Grayson. There's more going on here. Stuff they're not telling us." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" O'Donnell glanced around the room, his eyes darting toward the door. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I've been monitoring the system logs. Renner's been accessing classified files, stuff that isn't supposed to be connected to this facility's network. And the data, it's not just about the fragment." "What is it about?" He hesitated, his hands tightening around the tablet. "Experiments," he said finally. "They've been running tests on something else, something they pulled out of the ice months ago. I don't know what it is, but it's alive. Or it was." A chill ran down my spine. "Why haven't we been told about this?" O'Donnell laughed bitterly. "Because they don't want us asking questions. Renner's keeping it locked down in sub-level 4. No one's allowed down there except for him and Maddox. Sub-level 4. I hadn't even known it existed. The facility's schematics, the ones I'd been briefed on, only mentioned 3 levels. "You're sure about this?" I asked. He nodded, his face pale. "I hacked into the surveillance feeds last night. Saw Maddox down there, wheeling in one of the cryo units. Whatever's in it, it's not human." Before I could respond, the cafeteria door swung open and Victor Harlow strode in, his boots clanging loudly against the metal floor. His sharp eyes locked onto O'Donnell and the technician shrank back into his seat. "What are you two whispering about?" Harlow asked, his tone brusque. "Nothing," O'Donnell said quickly, shoving his tablet into his bag. "Just reviewing some data." Harlow didn't look convinced. He pulled up a chair, his imposing frame towering over us. "Listen," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I don't know what you're trying to dig into, but if I were you, I'd stop." "Why?" I asked, meeting his gaze. "What aren't we being told?" Harlow leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think you're here to study the fragment. That's what they told me too when I signed on. But this place? It's not a research facility, it's a testing ground. For what? Harlow hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the camera mounted in the corner of the room. I don't know everything, he admitted, but I've seen enough to know they're hiding something. Renner's not just running experiments, he's following orders from higher up. NASA? I asked, though the word felt hollow even as I said it. NASA's just a cover, Harlow said darkly. This goes way beyond them. There's a reason this place is off the grid, buried under miles of ice. Whatever they're doing here, it's not meant for the outside world. Before I could press him further, an announcement crackled over the intercom. Dr. Grayson, Dr. Maddox, and Dr. Renner, report to the containment chamber immediately. Repeat, report to the containment chamber. Harlow straightened, his expression hard. Watch your back, Grayson, he said. This place doesn't feel right. And when something doesn't feel right, it usually isn't. The containment chamber was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Renner and Maddox stood near the observation window, their faces lit by the faint glow of the fragment. The symbols on its surface were shifting faster now, their patterns growing more intricate with each passing second. What's going on? I asked, stepping up beside them. Maddox grinned, his eyes alight with excitement. It's responding again. The energy spikes are off the charts. This is it, Grayson. It's trying to communicate. Renner didn't share his enthusiasm. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. We've detected a secondary signal, he said, his voice tight. Something is amplifying the fragment's output. What does that mean? I asked. Renner hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Maddox. It means, he said carefully, the fragment isn't working alone. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I realized what he was implying. The fragment wasn't just some ancient artifact. It was part of something larger, something connected to whatever was buried deeper in the facility. And whatever it was waking up. The announcement from Renner stayed with me like a splinter lodged under my skin. The fragment isn't working alone. That sentence looped in my mind, raising more questions than answers. By the time I left the containment chamber, I had made up my mind. I needed to know what was in sub-level 4. Facility Polaris was a labyrinth of corridors and reinforced doors, each one marked with a numeric designation. Most of the time, the hallways were dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the fragment that seemed to seep into every corner of the lab. Tonight, though, the corridors felt darker, the hum deeper, as if the air itself was thickening with some unseen force. The elevator to sub-level 4 wasn't marked on the schematics I'd reviewed before arriving, but after my conversation with O'Donnell and Harlow, I knew where to look. Hidden behind a series of locked panels in the farthest reaches of the lab, the elevator was guarded by a biometric scanner that required high-level clearance. Harlow had been reluctant to help at first. You don't want to see what's down there, Grayson, he'd said, his face a mask of unease. But after a tense exchange and a promise that I'd take full responsibility, he relented. You've got balls, he muttered as he handed over a cloned access card. Just don't say I didn't warn you. The card worked. The elevator doors slid open silently, revealing a small, windowless chamber illuminated by a single red light. I stepped inside and pressed the button for sub-level 4, the panel's surface cold against my fingertips. As the doors closed, the hum of the fragment seemed to intensify, vibrating through the floor beneath my boots. The descent felt like an eternity. The walls of the elevator groaned faintly as it traveled deeper into the glacier, and the air grew colder with every passing second. My breath fogged in the dim light, and my chest tightened with a mix of dread and anticipation. What was I about to find? When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a corridor that was unlike anything I'd seen in the facility above. The walls were lined with thick, frosted glass, and behind them, faint shadows shifted in the dim light. The air smelled of chemicals and something else, something organic, but wrong. It was the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat and made your stomach churn. I stepped forward cautiously, the sound of my boots echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. As I passed the first glass chamber, I glanced inside and froze. It was a cryo unit, its surface frosted over from years of operation. Inside was a shape, humanoid, but deformed, its body twisted in ways that defied biology. The skin was pale and translucent, its veins dark and pulsing faintly. The eyes, if they were eyes, were black pits that seemed to follow me as I moved. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I forced myself to keep walking, though my legs felt like lead. Each chamber I passed revealed another nightmare. Bodies suspended in thick, viscous liquid, their forms distorted and alien. Some were clearly human, remnants of the facility's earlier experiments, but others were something else entirely. At the end of the corridor was a reinforced door, its surface marked with the same shifting symbols that covered the fragment. The sight of them made my skin crawl, but I pressed forward, swiping the cloned access card again. The door hissed open and a wave of frigid air rushed out, carrying with it that same acrid metallic scent. The room beyond was a cavernous lab, its walls lined with monitors and equipment that hummed softly in the cold. At the center of the room was a massive containment unit, its surface covered in frost and glowing faintly with a pale blue light. Cables and tubes snaked across the floor, connecting the unit to the surrounding machines. And standing beside it, his back to me, was Dr. Maddox. He didn't react to my presence at first, his attention fully absorbed by the data streaming across the monitors. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I saw what he was watching. The screen displayed a live feed of the containment unit's interior, where something massive and grotesque writhed in the freezing liquid. "Maddox," I said, my voice sharp. "What the hell is going on down here?" He turned slowly, his face pale but calm. "Grayson," he said, his tone almost casual. "I wondered when you'd show up." I gestured to the containment unit. "What is that?" Maddox smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "That," he said, "is the future. Or at least, that's what Renner thinks." "Renner knows about this?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Of course he does," Maddox said. "He's the one who proved the experiments. You didn't think the fragment was the only thing we found, did you? This came from the same ice, buried even deeper. And unlike the fragment, it's very much alive." I stared at the writhing form in the containment unit, my mind racing. Its shape was constantly shifting, its limbs, if they could be called that, stretching and retracting as if searching for something. The liquid around it bubbled faintly, and the symbols on its surface glowed brighter with each movement. "This isn't research," I said, my voice trembling. "This is madness." Maddox laughed softly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Madness or not, it's working. The fragment is responding to it. They're connected, Grayson. Two pieces of the same puzzle." "And what happens when the puzzle is complete?" I demanded. Maddox didn't answer. He just smiled, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and awe. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't in control of anything. None of us were. The containment unit trembled. The faint vibration in the air had grown into something far more tangible, ominous, alive, and thrumming like the beat of an alien heart. The liquid within the tank churned violently, and the cables snaking out from the containment unit strained and creaked as if they were holding something barely contained. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the frost-covered floor. The creature inside, it wasn't just writhing anymore. It was aware. "Maddox," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. His face was illuminated by the faint blue glow of the containment unit, his expression one of rapturous awe. He stepped closer to the tank, ignoring the faint, rhythmic banging that had started coming from inside it. "Stop!" I barked, my voice sharp. "Don't go near it!" Maddox turned his head slightly, enough to glance at me over his shoulder. "Do you feel it, Grayson? That pull, it's trying to show us something beyond our comprehension." The cables attached to the unit sparked violently, a shower of orange and white light scattering across the room. A low, guttural hum emanated from the tank, resonating deep in my chest, like a vibration in my bones. Maddox ignored it. He reached out, his hand trembling, his fingers brushing the frost-covered glass of the containment unit. Then the creature opened its eyes, or rather, the pits where its eyes should have been. The empty sockets glowed faintly, black holes ringed with shifting lights that spiraled inward. For a split second, I felt myself slipping, like my mind was falling into those dark, endless voids. My thoughts blurred, fragmented, as if something inside the creature was pulling me in. A loud bang snapped me back to reality. Victor Harlow stormed into the room, his weapon drawn, his expression grim. "Grayson," he barked, "what the hell are you doing down here?" I staggered backward, shaking my head to clear the fog. "Harlow, thank God. Maddox, he's..." I stopped mid-sentence. Maddox was still there, his hand pressed against the glass, his lips moving silently as though speaking to the creature. The glow in the containment unit intensified, the light so bright it cast jagged shadows across the walls. "We need to get out of here," Harlow said, his voice low and urgent. "This whole facility is going to hell." The ground shook violently, a deep, reverberating tremor that sent instruments crashing to the floor. Overhead lights flickered wildly and the air filled with the acrid stench of burning wires. The fragment's hum, always present, always background noise, rose to a deafening roar, its tone warped and alien, as though it were screaming. "What's happening?" I shouted over the noise. "The fragment's reacting to it," Harlow said, jerking his head toward the containment unit. "They're connected. I don't know how, but whatever's in there, it's waking everything up." Suddenly, the containment unit cracked. A jagged fissure spread across the glass, followed by a hissing sound as the freezing liquid inside began to seep out. Maddox stepped back, his face a mask of awe and terror. "It's not contained anymore," he murmured. "It's coming through." "No!" Harlow shouted, raising his weapon. "Step away, Maddox." Maddox didn't listen. He turned to us, a strange smile on his face. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "This is evolution. This is what we've been waiting for." Before Harlow could respond, the glass shattered. The force of the explosion sent shards flying across the room and I threw myself to the ground, covering my head as freezing liquid sprayed in all directions. The hum from the fragment reached a fever pitch, a sound so loud it felt like it was splitting my skull. When I looked up, the creature was free. It towered over us, its form constantly shifting, limbs stretching and retracting in ways that defied physics. Its surface glistened like wet obsidian, and the symbols that adorned the fragment now crawled across its body, glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. The creature turned its eyeless gaze toward Maddox, who stood frozen in place, his smile faltering as the reality of the situation finally hit him. "Maddox, get back!" I shouted, but it was too late. The creature lashed out with one of its tendrils, a whip-like appendage that moved faster than I could comprehend. It struck Maddox square in the chest, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. He didn't scream. He didn't have time. The tendril wrapped around him, and with a sickening crunch, his body crumpled inward, vanishing into the creature's mass. "Jesus Christ!" Harlow yelled, firing his weapon. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the confined space, but the bullets didn't even slow the thing down. They struck its surface and vanished, absorbed without so much as a ripple. "It's not working!" Harlow shouted, backing toward me. "Stop shooting!" I yelled. "It's feeding off the energy." Harlow lowered his weapon, his breathing ragged. "Then how the hell do we stop it?" The creature turned toward us, its tendrils coiling and uncoiling, its body radiating an intense heat that filled the room with a stifling, suffocating pressure. The symbols along its surface pulsed faster, brighter, as though reacting to the fragment's escalating hum. "We have to sever the connection," I said, my mind racing. "The fragment, it's amplifying whatever this thing is. If we shut it down..." Another violent tremor cut me off, the floor beneath us splitting open as cracks spread through the facility. The creature let out a deafening guttural roar, a sound that felt more like an intrusion into my mind than an actual noise. My vision blurred, my knees buckling as the overwhelming force pressed down on me. "Grayson, move!" Harlow grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the exit. "We need to get out of here, now!" I stumbled after him, the world tilting and spinning as alarms blared and the walls groaned under the strain. Behind us, the creature expanded, its tendrils reaching out and consuming everything in their path. And through it all, the fragment's hum continued to rise, its tone fracturing into something incomprehensible. As we fled the room, I realized the truth. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. This was a door we had opened, and something far worse was coming through. The facility was coming apart. Harlow dragged me through the trembling corridor as the alarms blared louder and the walls groaned under unseen pressure. Behind us, the creature's guttural roar echoed like a living nightmare, and the fragment's hum had mutated into a pulsating wail, each vibration rattling through my skull. "Keep moving," Harlow barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. He shoved me forward as another tremor rocked the floor, sending chunks of ice and metal crashing around us. The emergency lights flickered, casting jagged shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real. "We have to stop it," I shouted, barely able to hear my own voice. "If we don't shut the fragment down, it'll spread." "It's already spreading!" Harlow yelled back, his face grim. "But if you've got an idea, now's the time to share it." We burst into the main lab where the fragment sat in its containment chamber, its shifting surface glowing with blinding intensity. The symbols carved into its metallic shell pulsed erratically, their patterns growing faster and more chaotic. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like the gravity had doubled. I could barely breathe. The creature followed us, its massive form filling the corridor behind. It was larger now, its tendrils stretching into impossible shapes that scraped the ceiling and walls, leaving trails of melting ice. Its eyeless gaze fixed on the fragment, and for the first time I realized the horrifying truth. "It's using the fragment to stabilize itself," I said, my voice trembling. "It's feeding on the energy to finish its transformation." "Then how do we kill it?" Harlow demanded, his weapon uselessly hanging at his side. "We sever the power," I said, rushing to the control panel. My hands flew over the interface, but the system was in chaos. Error messages and corrupted data filled the screen. The fragment's energy output was off the charts, overwhelming every failsafe. Another tremor shook the room, and I stumbled as the creature surged forward. One of its tendrils lashed out, striking a nearby console and sending sparks flying. Harlow fired a few desperate shots, but the bullets were swallowed by the creature's shifting mass. "This isn't working," he shouted. "We're out of time." I ignored him, my focus locked on the emergency override. If I could trigger a shutdown, even temporarily, it might destabilize the connection. But the system wasn't responding. The fragment's energy had corrupted everything, its influence spreading like a virus. Then I saw it. The manual kill switch, buried beneath a protective cover on the far side of the room. It was a failsafe, disconnected from the system, designed to physically sever the fragment's power source. But it wasn't meant to be used lightly. Activating it would overload the facility's reactors, triggering a meltdown that would destroy everything and everyone within a 5-mile radius. "There's no way out, is there?" Harlow said quietly, following my gaze. "No," I admitted, my chest tightening. "But it's the only way to stop it." Harlow nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then do it." I ran toward the switch, dodging falling debris and the lashing tendrils of the creature. The air burned with the heat radiating from its massive form, and the fragment's wail grew deafening, drilling into my skull like a living scream. My hands shook as I ripped the cover off the switch, exposing the red lever beneath. The creature turned toward me, its shifting form surging forward, but Harlow stepped in its path. "Go!" he shouted, firing wildly at the thing. "I'll hold it off." "No!" I screamed, but there was no time. Harlow charged the creature, slamming into one of its tendrils with the butt of his weapon. It barely flinched, but his sacrifice bought me the seconds I needed. With a final breath, I yanked the lever. The facility roared as the reactors overloaded, and a blinding flash of light consumed everything. The fragment shattered, its pieces disintegrating into shards of light, and the creature let out an ear-splitting scream as its form collapsed, dissolving into black, writhing tendrils that faded into the air. Then there was silence. I don't know how I survived. When I woke, I was lying in the snow, the remains of Facility Polaris scattered around me in jagged pieces of steel and ice. The cold bit into my skin, but I couldn't feel it. My mind was blank, my thoughts fragmented, as if part of me had been left behind in the explosion. The horizon was empty, no helicopters, no rescue teams, just an endless expanse of white. I staggered to my feet, my body screaming in protest. The fragment was gone, obliterated along with the lab and everyone inside. Harlow, Maddox, Renner, none of them had made it. Their sacrifices had stopped the creature, but the cost was more than I could bear. But as I stumbled away from the wreckage, something caught my eye. A faint glow in the distance. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned to face it. It was faint, barely visible against the snow, but it was there. Symbols, glowing softly in the ice. The same symbols that had covered the fragment. The same ones that had crawled across the creature's shifting form. They pulsed slowly, almost like a heartbeat. And as I stood there, staring at the impossible, I heard it again. The hum. Faint, distant, but alive. The ice had kept it secret for millennia, but now it was awake. And I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't finished with us yet.